April 7, 1945. Tokyo Bay, Empire of Japan. The first light of dawn spreads over Japan's home islands as 91 North American P-51D Mustangs from the 15th and 21st Fighter Groups close in on their rendezvous point. In his Mustang's cockpit, Major James B. Tapp grips the control stick tightly. His 6 wing-mounted .50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns are loaded with armor-piercing incendiary rounds. The early P-51D models carry 500 rounds for each inner gun and 270 for the center and outer ones, 2,880 rounds total. Later versions would cut that to 400 rounds per inner gun for better reliability, bringing the total down to 1,880 rounds. Far below, Mount Fuji rises in clear view, majestic and unmistakable. Its snow-capped peak serves as a guide for pilots through the mission. The morning sun stretches long shadows over the countryside, revealing a patchwork of rice fields, villages, and military sites, places that had never seen American fighters before. This mission is unlike any other, escorting B-29 superfortresses deep into the Japanese homeland from a base 750 miles away, a feat that, just 2 years earlier, military planners believed impossible for single-engine fighters. At 0700 hours, over 100 Japanese interceptors swarm toward the American formation. Through the morning haze, they see something that leaves them stunned, single-engine American fighters over Tokyo, something their commanders had sworn could never happen. Rephrased, simple, engaging, same wording preserved. The psychological shock hits instantly, and hard. These aren't short-range, carrier-based Navy fighters. These are land-based Army Air Force Mustangs that have somehow flown 750 miles across open ocean to appear above Japan's capital. Leading Japan's defense are pilots flying the Nakajima Ki-84 Hate, the Frank, Japan's fastest and most advanced fighter. Alongside them are older aircraft, the Ki-43 Hayabusa, the Ki-44 Shoki, the Ki-61 Hien, and Navy fighters like the A-6M0 and N-1K2J Shurden. The Ki-84 could outclimb and outmaneuver the P-51 and even the P-47 Thunderbolt at certain speeds and altitudes. What follows will show the vast technological gap between two nations' approaches to air warfare, and explain why American industry created what many pilots called the perfect long-range fighter. The North American P-51D Mustang entered the Pacific with a reputation already earned over Europe. It had shattered the Luftwaffe and made daylight bombing of Germany possible. Originally built for Britain, the early Mustangs became truly great when the British replaced their Allison engines with Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, turning them into America's most capable fighters. That transformation, from the Allison-powered versions to the Merlin-powered masterpiece, became one of aviation's greatest collaborations, American aerodynamic design meeting British engineering genius. The result, the P-51D, gave the U.S. Army Air Forces a fighter that was fast, high-flying, and could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, and now, unbelievably, from Iwo Jima to Tokyo and back. Its heart was the Packard-built V-1650-7 engine, a licensed version of the Rolls-Royce Merlin 66. With water injection, it produced 1,695 horsepower at takeoff and up to 1,720 in emergency power. Its two-stage, two-speed supercharger kept the engine strong even at extreme altitudes, while Japanese engines, with only single-stage superchargers, struggled for air in the thin atmosphere. Rephrased, simple, engaging, same wording preserved. The P-51D Mustang could reach top speeds of around 440 miles per hour at 25,000 feet and soar up to nearly 42,000 feet. It carried 6 wing-mounted .50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, giving it incredible firepower. The math behind that firepower was both precise and terrifying. Each of the 6 Brownings fired 800 rounds per minute, together unleashing 4,800 rounds every minute, or 80 rounds every second. Each armor-piercing incendiary bullet weighed 46 grams and left the barrel at 2,900 feet per second, hitting with immense force. A few accurate bursts could punch through armor, ignite fuel tanks, or rip an enemy engine apart. By late 1944, 14 of the 15 fighter squadrons in the U.S. 8th Air Force were flying Mustangs, a clear sign of the aircraft's unmatched dominance. This incredible deployment showed the full strength of American industry at its peak, with factories working around the clock, 7 days a week. At North American Aviation's massive plants in Inglewood, California, and Dallas, Texas, Mustangs rolled off the lines at a pace that seemed unbelievable. One brand new P-51 every hour. By the end of the war, a total of 15,586 had been built. All versions of the P-51 Mustang were built in huge numbers. But the D model alone accounted for 8,156 aircraft, more than Japan produced of all its fighter types combined in the final 2 years of the war. The long-range power that carried the Mustangs all the way to Tokyo marked a revolution in air combat. It completely changed the math of air warfare. With two 110-gallon drop tanks, Mustangs could fly round trips of 1,500 miles with ease, and sometimes stretch that to 1,600 when needed. That's like flying from Los Angeles to Little Rock, Arkansas, completely over water, in a single-engine plane, with the ocean as the only emergency landing option. The secret behind this incredible range was the Merlin engine's amazing fuel efficiency. At cruising speed, it used just 65 gallons per hour. Combined with the Mustang's advanced laminar flow wing, designed by North American aerodynamicist Edgar Schmud, it reduced drag by 35% compared to traditional wings. The wing's shape kept airflow smooth for longer, delaying turbulence and cutting resistance dramatically. In sharp contrast stood Japan's Nakajima Ki-84 Hate, which entered service with the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service in June 1944. Too late, and in too few numbers, to change the war's outcome. Known as Gale to the Japanese and Frank to the Allies, it was Japan's last effort to counter America's growing technological dominance with the little industry they had left. The Ki-84 was arguably Japan's best fighter to see wide use, though wide use meant something very different for Japan than for America. What Japan called mass production, the US would have called a prototype run. The Frank was fast, agile, and heavily armed, with up to two 30mm Ho, 155 cannons and two 20mm Ho 5 cannons, giving it fierce firepower. But in practice, things were less ideal. Those 30mm cannons carried only 50 rounds per gun, limiting their real effectiveness in battle. The 20mm cannons carried only 150 rounds each, just 400 rounds total compared to the Mustang's 1,880 to 2,800. On paper, the Ki-84 looked like a serious rival, even superior in some ways. It was powered by the Nakajima Ha-45 Hamar 18-cylinder radial engine, a complex design with fuel injection, a single-stage 2-speed supercharger, and water methanol injection that boosted takeoff power to 2,000 horsepower. Early tests were promising. Prototypes reached 387 miles per hour in level flight, with later claims of 427 miles per hour under perfect conditions, using high-octane fuel and ideal engine tuning. But the harsh truth of late-war Japan told a different story, one of declining quality, desperate shortcuts, and systemic failure. Pilots and mechanics quickly learned to be cautious with the Ki-84's high-maintenance Hamar engine and fragile landing gear, which had a habit of collapsing at the worst moments. The Hamar, though powerful in theory, became notoriously unreliable as Japan's industry crumbled. The engine's precision parts required materials and tolerances that bombed-out factories and low-quality steel could no longer provide. The landing gear suffered too. Poor heat treatment of late-war Japanese steel left it brittle and weak, full of impurities that made proper hardening impossible. Many Hayates were lost when their struts buckled on landing, destroying precious aircraft and killing pilots who had taken months to train. This gap in production quality reflected Japan's larger industrial collapse, a nation that had bet everything on a short, decisive war and was now paying the price for losing that gamble. While American factories kept consistent quality, even improving it as production methods advanced, Japanese manufacturing fell apart rapidly. Quality control declined so badly that pilots could never be sure how their aircraft would perform. They didn't know if the brakes would work, if the engine would hold together under full power, or if their planes could even climb high enough to reach the B-29 superfortresses flying at 30,000 feet. By 1945, Japan had built only 3,514 Ki-84s in total. Many of them never left the ground because there weren't enough spare parts, fuel, or trained pilots. Of the planes that were still operational, maybe half were truly combat-ready at any given time. Fuel shortages revealed the full scale of Japan's crisis. The country had gone to war partly to secure oil, yet now it had almost none. American pilots flew with 100-octane aviation fuel shipped from refineries in Texas and California, fuel made specifically for high-performance engines. Japanese pilots, meanwhile, had to rely on whatever could be made at home or synthesized from coal. By the final year of the war, Japan's aviation fuel often tested at only 87 octane, or even as low as 80, stripping engines of power and causing dangerous pre-ignition that wrecked cylinders, pistons, and valves. In desperation, some air units mixed in pine root oil from stumps, alcohol from sweet potatoes, and even leftovers from sake brewing. These makeshift fuels only made things worse. Pilots described engines that barely started, ran rough at all power settings, and often failed completely in midair. And yet, on that first mission of April 7th, the Mustangs rose into formation with their B-29 charges. Ready to make history over Japan, a total of 103 Boeing B-29 Superfortresses from the 73rd Bomb Wing filled the skies, each loaded with tons of incendiary bombs aimed at Japan's industrial heart. Captain Art Bridge of the 45th Fighter Squadron remembered the scene vividly. It was a real spectacle. The B-29s were just finishing their assembly in a grand circle as we arrived. The sun glinted off their aluminum skin. They looked like a school of giant silver fish swimming through the sky. The rendezvous itself was a masterpiece of precision and planning, something only possible through American technology and training. The P-51 Mustangs had flown 750 miles across open ocean, relying mostly on dead reckoning and basic radio compasses, timing their arrival to meet the bombers within minutes. They climbed steadily from sea level to 25,000 feet, their engines automatically adjusting fuel mixture as they ascended. The superchargers shifted smoothly from low to high power, keeping the engines strong as they rose higher into the thin air. Crossing the coast of Honshu, the Mustang pilots released their 110-gallon drop tanks, spotting the first faint specks of Japanese fighters ahead, more than 100 interceptors launching from airfields around Tokyo. The silver tanks spiraled down toward the earth, flashing in the morning sun, some exploding on impact, others bouncing across rice fields. The Japanese pilots, flying a mix of Ki-84s, Ki-43s, Ki-44s, Ki-61s, and Navy fighters like the famous Zero and the new N-1K-2J Shurden-Kai, were about to face a stunning realization. These were not short-range Navy carrier planes. These were land-based fighters, American Mustangs, that had somehow reached Japan's home skies from bases everyone believed were impossibly far away. Flight Sergeant Todanimizu, flying a Ki-84 with the 56th Sentai, later recalled his disbelief. When we were scrambled, we were told enemy fighters were approaching Tokyo. We thought it was a mistake. Maybe they meant bombers. When I saw the Mustangs with my own eyes, I thought I was dreaming. It was impossible. Our commanders had assured us that no American fighter could reach Japan from their island bases. Yet there they were, dozens of them, flying as if they owned our sky. In that moment, I knew the war was truly lost. Major James B. Tapp, who would later become an ace with 8 confirmed victories, was among the first Mustang pilots to dive into the Japanese formations. His combat report, written just hours after the mission, described the battle with precise, almost clinical detail. They came at us in the usual 3-plane Shodai formation, but their coordination was poor. The flight leader would attack, yet his wingmen often hesitated or failed to follow. They seemed unsure, maybe low on fuel, ammo, or simply lacking experience. We dove through them with a 100-mile-per-hour speed advantage, fired short bursts, and climbed back up before they could react. This collapse in Japanese formation discipline revealed the deeper crisis in their air force, an almost total breakdown in pilot training. By 1945, most of Japan's skilled aviators were gone, lost over the Solomons, New Guinea, the Philippines, or during the massive aerial slaughter known as the Marianas Turkey Shoot. By 1945, Japanese pilot training had collapsed so badly that replacements were sent into combat with as little as 50 hours of flight time, compared to the 600 hours American pilots logged before ever seeing battle. When the smoke cleared and the Mustangs returned to their Iwo Jima base, the Sunsetters of the 7th Fighter Command were credited with 26 Japanese aircraft destroyed, 1 probable and 5 damaged, at the cost of just 2 P-51s and 1 pilot. That first mission's 13-to-1 kill ratio would only rise as the campaign continued. As American pilots gained experience and Japanese training declined further, the ratios climbed to 20-to-1, even 30-to-1 to 1, numbers that reflected not only American skill and technology, but also Japan's growing desperation. In combat, the difference between the planes became painfully clear, especially in vertical fights high above the earth, where most air battles now took place. The P-51D's advantage was overwhelming above 20,000 feet, the altitude where most interceptions happened. Its Merlin engine's two-stage supercharger kept the Mustang powerful at any height. The first stage compressed the thin air, cooled it through an intercooler, and then passed it to the second stage for even more compression, feeding the engine with dense, oxygen-rich air. The Ki-84's single-stage supercharger, with no intercooler and no second stage, couldn't keep up. Its power dropped sharply above 20,000 feet, taking away its speed and climb advantage right where it mattered most. At 30,000 feet, the Ki-84 could barely manage 350 miles per hour, while the P-51D still pushed past 420 miles per hour. Lieutenant Jerry Yellen of the 78th Fighter Squadron, who would later fly the final combat mission of World War II on August 14, 1945, August 15 in Japan, described a typical dogfight. We'd see them climbing to meet us, leaving dark exhaust trails as they shoved their throttles full forward. But by 25,000 feet, they were wallowing like fish out of water. Their engines were smoking, probably running too rich because their superchargers couldn't get enough air. We'd dive through their formation, our 6.50s blazing the tracers looked like laser beams, Lieutenant Yellen recalled, and the Japanese just couldn't match our speed, either in the dive or in the climb afterward. Our Merlin engines would sing as we pulled up, G-forces crushing us into our seats, while their radial engines coughed and sputtered, fighting just to stay alive. The P-51D could dive at nearly 500 miles per hour and still stay perfectly controllable, thanks to its laminar flow wings that remained stable even as it approached transonic speeds. Japanese fighters, on the other hand, often suffered from control reversal or even structural failure when diving past 400 miles per hour. Their control surfaces would lock up, or their wings would literally tear off. The difference in pilot skill only made things worse for Japan, and it grew more obvious every day. American pilots arriving at Iwo Jima had between 400 and 600 hours of flight training, including over 100 hours in the Mustang itself. They'd spent dozens of hours practicing gunnery, formation flying, and air combat against veteran instructors who'd fought in Europe or the Pacific. They trained in all weather, learned to navigate solely by instruments, and mastered deflection shooting against towed targets. Their tactics were based on 3 full years of real combat experience. Japanese pilots in 1945, by contrast, often had fewer than 100 hours total flight time, sometimes as little as 30. Many had barely practiced gunnery at all because ammunition was scarce. Most had no instrument training, and their combat tactics came not from veterans but from manuals, since nearly all experienced instructors were either dead or still flying combat missions themselves. Even the act of navigation separated the trained from the doomed. It was the difference between the doomed and the living, between those who would make it home and those who would soon be gone. Flying single-engine fighters on 1,500-mile round trips across endless ocean demanded more than courage. It required confidence built on experience and faith in both the machine and the systems supporting it. American pilots had that. They flew with detailed weather reports gathered from submarines and reconnaissance flights. Their maps were constantly updated from aerial photos, their instruments precise and reliable. Along their route, rescue submarines waited, the Lifeguard League, ready to save any downed airman. If they ditched at sea, PBY Dumbo flying boats could swoop in to pull them from the water. Japanese pilots had none of that. They flew with outdated maps that no longer matched the bombed-out landscape below. Their compasses were unreliable, never properly calibrated, and if they went down over water, rescue was impossible. Many didn't even have working life rafts, and if they did, they leaked. The emergency rations packed aboard were often already eaten back at base, used to fight hunger on the ground. There was even luck in geography. The magnetic variation between Iwo Jima and Tokyo in 1945 was only 3 degrees west. Tokyo sat between the 139th and 140th meridians, Iwo Jima between the 141st and 142nd, a near-perfect alignment. It meant that to get home, a pilot just needed to fly a simple compass heading. That small coincidence saved countless American lives when weather turned bad or dogfights left them disoriented, their compasses spinning wildly. They could simply turn south-southeast and know, eventually, Iwo Jima's volcanic outline would rise ahead of them through the clouds, that if a pilot had enough fuel, he'd eventually see Mount Suribachi rising from the ocean, the unmistakable sign that he was almost home. The supply systems behind each side showed the real story of the Pacific Air War, a battle between American abundance and Japanese desperation. Every mission from Iwo Jima sent nearly 100 P-51 Mustangs roaring into the sky, burning through 57,000 gallons of high-octane fuel and firing 230,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, plus carrying bombs and rockets for ground attacks. And that was just one day from one airbase. Iwo Jima had 3 fighter groups operating like this every day. Behind it all stretched an enormous American supply chain, from the factories in Detroit and refineries in Texas to ammunition plants in Missouri. Liberty ships, built at the incredible rate of 3 per day, carried supplies across the ocean. C-54 transport planes flew constant cargo routes, delivering what was needed to keep the fight going. Every single day, ships arrived at Iwo Jima, unloading fuel, ammo, spare parts, food, mail, the 1,000 little things that kept a modern air force alive and lethal. Japan's side was the opposite, chaos and collapse. Aviation fuel was so scarce that training flights were canceled, leaving new pilots to enter battle with barely any flight time. Ammunition was rationed so tightly that pilots were told to shoot only when absolutely sure of a hit. The Army and Navy Air Forces, never well coordinated even in peacetime, were now reduced to fighting each other for scraps of resources. Old aircraft were stripped for parts until only aluminum skeletons remained. Entire fighter units sat grounded for lack of tires, spark plugs, or hydraulic fluid. Some desperate squadrons even tried to make their own spare parts in crude workshops, but the results were as bad as you'd expect. The gap in technology went far beyond just the airplanes. It touched every part of how each side fought. American pilots flew with advanced gear that kept them alive and effective. They wore special suits that prevented blackouts during high-G maneuvers by pushing blood back to the brain. Their oxygen systems worked flawlessly even above 30,000 feet, automatically adjusting airflow. They talked to each other on VHF radios that were clear, reliable, and had multiple channels. Their parachutes were regularly inspected and repacked. Their life rafts had working radios, fresh food, and even fishing kits. Their survival packs carried everything from morphine to signal flares, all designed to bring them home alive. Japanese pilots had none of that. Many flew without working radios. Their old vacuum tube sets drained batteries fast and rarely functioned properly. Their oxygen systems were unreliable and often failed above 20,000 feet, causing pilots to black out or lose coordination from lack of oxygen. They didn't have G-suits either, meaning they couldn't turn or dive as hard as the Americans without passing out or bursting blood vessels in their eyes. On June 1, 1945, a day the Mustang pilots would remember as Black Friday, the weather, not the enemy, became their deadliest foe. Around 150 Mustangs heading for Osaka flew straight into a massive storm that hadn't shown up on forecasts. In just minutes, 27 aircraft were lost, 24 of them to the weather alone. Pilots got trapped inside towering clouds, lost control, collided with each other, or ran out of fuel searching for a break in the storm. Even with all their advanced technology, the Americans learned that day that these long-range missions pushed both men and machines right to the edge of survival. The storm stretched from sea level all the way up to 40,000 feet. Turbulence slammed the planes like waves in a stormy sea. Ice formed on the wings, and visibility dropped to zero. Pilots saw eerie blue lightning, St. Elmo's fire, dancing along their wingtips. Their compasses spun wildly, and their instruments failed as the gyroscopes couldn't keep up with the violent shaking. For the Japanese, morale collapsed completely. Captain Yoshio Yoshida, a Ki-84 pilot with the 47th Sentai who survived the war, wrote in his diary, "The appearance of American fighters over Tokyo has destroyed our confidence. We were told the B-29s were weak without escorts, that their fighters could never reach our homeland. But now, Mustangs fly above the Emperor's palace, strafing our airfields in broad daylight, shooting down our best pilots as if they were trainees. How can we protect the Emperor when the enemy rules our skies? Seeing those Mustangs, so confident, so many, tells us the truth our leaders deny. The war is lost, and we are only waiting to die." Major James B. Tapp, in a post-war interview, described the VLR, very long range, missions as the ultimate test of endurance. Fighting Japanese pilots got your blood pumping, he said, but the hardest part was just getting there and back. The ocean felt endless, empty, hypnotic. You kept checking your compass, praying it wasn't wrong, wondering if you were already lost. Each mission pushed pilots to their physical and mental limits. They sat strapped into their cramped cockpits for 8 hours or more, unable to stand, stretch, or move. They had to use a frozen relief tube for bathroom breaks. Their legs cramped painfully, their backs went numb, and after hours in the seat, they wondered if they'd ever walk again. Every second carried a quiet terror, flying a single-engine fighter over an endless ocean, knowing one mechanical failure meant certain death. The Mustang's reliability was their only lifeline. The Mustang's cockpit design, perfected through 3 years of real combat and thousands of pilot reports, was better than anything the Japanese had. The P-51's bubble canopy gave pilots a full 360-degree view, letting them actually see behind them just by turning their heads, a huge advantage that often meant the difference between life and death. Every part of the cockpit was built for comfort and performance. The seat could adjust for pilots of different heights, and the rudder pedals moved to fit longer or shorter legs. All the main controls were easy to reach and designed to reduce fatigue on long missions. The instrument panel was smartly arranged, with speed, altitude, and engine gauges right where the pilot could see them without looking away from the fight. By contrast, the Ki-84's cockpit, though better than older Japanese planes like the Zero, still had serious flaws. Rear visibility was poor because of metal supports and a fuel tank right behind the pilot's head. Many switches were in awkward spots, forcing pilots to take their hands off the controls at critical moments. The gauges were hard to read, especially when the plane shook violently in combat or under heavy G-forces. Weapons made the difference between living and dying in those split-second dogfights. The P-51's 6.50 caliber machine guns might not sound as impressive as the Ki-84's mixed cannons, but in real combat, they were far more effective. The American guns were incredibly reliable, jamming less than 1% of the time, thanks to skilled armorers who maintained them perfectly. They also carried much more ammunition, 1,880 to 2,080 rounds compared to the Ki-84's total of about 400. That meant Mustang pilots could take ranging shots, engage several enemies in one mission, and still have ammo left. Japanese pilots, on the other hand, often ran out after just a few bursts. The .50 caliber bullets were consistent and predictable. American pilots knew exactly how they flew and could hit targets from 400 yards away. Japanese pilots struggled with their mixed weapons, cannons and machine guns that fired shells with different speeds and drop rates, making accuracy almost impossible except at point-blank range. The gap widened even further with training. American pilots had fired thousands of rounds in practice, mastering how to lead a moving target, judge range, and fire in short, controlled bursts. They trained using towed targets, camera guns, and mock dogfights until aiming and shooting became pure instinct. In the end, the Mustang wasn't just a better machine. It was built for pilots who were better trained, better equipped, and ready for any fight. WWII 1945, most Japanese pilots were lucky if they fired 100 rounds in training, if that. Ammunition was far too scarce to waste on practice when every bullet was needed for battle. Many young pilots went into their first real dogfights without ever having fired their guns, forced to learn how to aim and shoot while someone was already trying to kill them. The Sunsetter's final air battle took place near Tokyo on August 10, 1945, when the 15th and 506th Fighter Groups claimed 7 kills in what became one of the last aerial duels of World War II. By then, Japanese resistance was little more than symbolic, a faint shadow of the powerful air force that had once dominated the Pacific. Fuel shortages had grounded most of Japan's remaining fighters. Their fuel tanks drained to keep kamikaze planes flying instead. The few aircraft that did take off were often flown by teenagers barely out of high school, boys who had only a few weeks of flight instruction before being thrown into combat. Between April and August 1945, the Mustangs from Iwo Jima were credited with 206 Japanese aircraft destroyed, about 75% of all P-51 victories in the Pacific. The real number was likely even higher since many enemy planes that went down over Japan were never officially confirmed, their wreckage lost in forests, mountains, or burned cities. But the Mustang's impact went far beyond their kill count. Their presence over Japan changed the course of the Pacific War. With P-51s providing escort, B-29 bombers could attack in daylight, hitting their targets with deadly precision and crippling Japan's industry. The effect on morale was shattering. Japanese civilians could see American fighters roaring overhead in broad daylight, strafing airfields, destroying trains, and attacking ships in Tokyo Bay. It was a clear, terrifying sign that Japan no longer controlled its own skies, and that the war was truly over in all but name. The ancient myth of the divine wind, that Japan would always be protected by fate, was finally shattered the day American fighters flew directly over the Imperial Palace. Lieutenant Colonel John R. Morgan of the 457th Fighter Squadron carried out several photo reconnaissance missions over Japan in a specially modified P-51D Mustang equipped with cameras instead of guns. What he saw from above revealed just how completely Japan's air power had collapsed. "We'd fly over airfields that intelligence said had hundreds of planes," Morgan recalled. "In reality, we'd find maybe a dozen that could actually fly. The rest were just wrecks, missing engines, no propellers, stripped bare for spare parts. Sometimes they'd drag the wrecks around to make it look like they had more planes, but you could always tell the difference between a fighter ready for battle and a hollow shell. Some airfields even had fake wooden planes, painted to look real, trying to trick us into wasting our bombs." The numbers told the story more clearly than anything else. The United States built 15,586 P-51 Mustangs of all types during the war, more than Japan produced of all aircraft combined in 1944 and 1945. Japan managed to build about 3,500 Ki, 84 Franks, but most never made it to combat. Destroyed on the ground by B-29 bombers or carrier raids, lost in training accidents, or simply grounded for lack of parts. While Japanese industry was collapsing, American production was peaking. North American Aviation alone was turning out 20 P-51s a day, more in a single day than Japan could produce Ki-84s in a month. Every American fighter rolled off the line identical and reliable, with interchangeable parts and strict quality standards. Japanese planes, by contrast, varied wildly in performance and build quality, even within the same model. The difference didn't stop at machines, it extended to men. By 1945, the United States was training 30,000 new pilots, a number Japan could no longer even dream of matching. Every year, the United States trained around 30,000 new pilots, each getting 200 to 300 hours of flight time before moving on to advanced fighter school, followed by another 100 hours of combat training. Japan's pilot training system, however, had completely collapsed. New recruits were lucky to get 50 hours of flying, often much less, before being thrown into combat. The math of war was merciless. America could replace its losses easily while keeping training standards high. Japan couldn't even replace its pilots, no matter how much it lowered the bar. For every one Japanese pilot trained, America trained 10, and the Americans were far better prepared. The fuel situation told the same grim story. Each P-51 Mustang mission from Iwo Jima burned about 600 gallons of 100-octane fuel per plane, counting both internal tanks and drop tanks. With 100 aircraft per mission, that was 60,000 gallons a day for a single fighter group. American tankers kept the supply flowing. Millions of gallons every month shipped across the Pacific like a river of fuel-feeding victory. Japan, meanwhile, was running on fumes. They were trying to make aviation fuel from pine roots, needing 200 tree stumps to make 1 gallon of poor-quality gasoline. They even turned training planes into kamikaze weapons because there wasn't enough fuel for real missions. By August 1945, Japan had less than 200,000 gallons of aviation fuel left, barely enough for one final major operation. The P-51D Mustang represented far more than just a fast, powerful airplane. It symbolized the American philosophy of war, mass production with precision, standardization across factories, and constant improvement. It was the product of a nation where technology, training, and industry worked together to win not just battles, but the war itself. Every P-51D Mustang that came off the production line was nearly identical, built through constant improvement based on real combat feedback. Each one had interchangeable parts and predictable performance. A pilot could jump into any Mustang and instantly know how it would fly, and where every switch and instrument was located. In contrast, Japanese aircraft were increasingly hand-built using low-quality or substitute materials, which led to huge performance differences, even between planes made in the same factory. One Ki-84 might hit 400 miles per hour, while another from the same batch barely reached 350 miles per hour, all because of inconsistent manufacturing. Brigadier General Ernest M. Moore, commander of the 7th Fighter Command, later said, "I don't believe there's any question that the P-51 was the best propeller fighter of World War II. It was our top air fighter, perfect for escort missions, and just as capable as the P-47 for ground attacks." His praise went beyond speed or power. It was about the Mustang's reliability, easy maintenance, and ability to handle extreme long-range missions. The P-51 could be refueled and rearmed in just 30 minutes, fly 2 missions a day, and even take off from rough coral runways that would have wrecked more fragile aircraft. The maintenance numbers told the real story. On Iwo Jima, the P-51D kept an operational rate above 80%, despite brutal conditions, volcanic dust clogging engines, salt air corroding metal, and makeshift outdoor workshops. Ground crews could swap an engine in just 4 hours using mobile cranes and standard procedures. Damage that would ground a Japanese fighter for weeks could be fixed overnight with prefabricated parts flown in from the US. Meanwhile, the Ki-84, even when it had fuel and ammunition, could only keep fewer than 40% of its planes ready to fly. The difference wasn't just in machines, it was in systems, discipline, and industrial power. Sometimes Japanese fighters had readiness rates as low as 20%. Their complex Ha-45 HAMAR engines needed specialized tools that often didn't exist, and trained technicians were either killed in action or drafted into combat units. Even when spare parts were available, they had to be hand-fitted, because manufacturing tolerances were so poor that no 2 parts were exactly the same. Meanwhile, the Americans had another powerful edge: weather reconnaissance, which saved countless lives. Dedicated B-29 weather ships would take off hours before the fighter missions, flying ahead to report cloud cover, wind speeds, and storm fronts. Their data helped mission planners plot safer routes and avoid dangerous weather systems. Still, even with all this preparation, nature could surprise them, as Black Friday had shown, when sudden storms turned an organized mission into chaos. The Japanese, without such reconnaissance, often flew blind into deadly weather, losing entire squadrons to storms before even meeting the enemy. America's ability to predict and avoid bad weather dramatically reduced operational losses, while Japanese units suffered more weather-related casualties than combat ones. Backing this up was a revolutionary communication network. High-frequency radio beacons on submarines and island bases guided planes over the vast Pacific. Submarine-based rescue teams could coordinate with search aircraft to find downed pilots, while real-time weather updates kept missions flexible and safe. This safety net gave pilots something priceless: confidence. They knew that if they went down, someone would come looking for them. That knowledge alone gave them the courage to fly farther, fight harder, and take risks their enemies couldn't afford. Japanese pilots, often flying without working radios and no chance of rescue if they were shot down, faced each mission with grim acceptance of death. Their farewell ceremonies before takeoff were not symbolic, they were real goodbyes. Most knew they wouldn't return. Captain Harry Krim Jr. of the 531st Fighter Squadron, who became an ace over Japan with 7 kills, summed up the situation with brutal honesty. "We owned the sky over Japan. We could go where we wanted, when we wanted. The Japanese knew it. We knew it. And most importantly, their civilians knew it." Every P-51 Mustang flying over Tokyo was a symbol of Japan's defeat. The Americans were no longer fighting for control of the skies. They already had it. Now they were demonstrating their dominance, showing the Japanese people that resistance was pointless. These very long-range missions completely changed the balance of the war in the Pacific. Distance was no longer Japan's shield. The tyranny of distance, which had protected their islands for centuries, was gone. For the first time, Japan's industrial heartland, which had survived untouched for most of the war, was exposed to daily attack. The sight of American fighters over Tokyo destroyed the last illusions that Japan could still defend itself. It shattered the myth of the divine wind that once promised to save them and proved that defeat was not only possible, it was certain. The human cost told the story in cold, unforgiving numbers, a reflection of the technological gap that decided the outcome of the Pacific War. Between July 1st and August 15th, 1945, 85 American fighter pilots lost their lives on very long-range, VLR, missions, but only a few were shot down in air combat, maybe 5 or 6 at most. Most of the deaths came from bad weather, mechanical failures, navigation mistakes, or simple fatigue that caused pilots to make fatal errors after hours in the air. In the same period, Japanese losses were catastrophic. Hundreds, possibly over 1,000 pilots. Entire squadrons were wiped out trying hopelessly to stop American formations. The 47th CENI, which began April with 40 pilots, had only 3 left by August. The 244th CENI was completely destroyed, reformed with new recruits, and then wiped out again. The final dogfights over Japan showed the complete collapse of Japanese air power as an organized fighting force. On August 14, 1945, August 15 in Japan, Lieutenant Jerry Yellin flew what became the last combat mission of World War II. He took off from Iwo Jima with his 19-year-old wingman, 2nd Lieutenant Philip Schlamberg, to attack airfields near Nagoya. The mission had been planned before Japan's surrender order reached the base, and the recall code word, Utah, never reached their radios. After strafing their targets, Yellin and Schlamberg turned for home, diving into clouds to avoid anti-aircraft fire. When Yellin came out of the clouds, Schlamberg was gone, shot down by ground fire. He became the last American combat death of World War II. Even in those final hours, with the war already ending and the Emperor preparing to surrender, men were still dying in the sky, victims of a war that refused to stop until its very last moment. Even after the Emperor had already recorded his surrender broadcast, Japanese anti-aircraft guns kept firing with desperate determination. But what was missing were Japanese fighter planes. They were gone, grounded by no fuel, no trained pilots, or simply destroyed. The math of the air war was final and undeniable, written in aluminum and blood across Japan's skies. The P-51D Mustang, with its 440 miles per hour top speed, 2,000-mile range using drop tanks, and 6 reliable .50 caliber machine guns loaded with nearly 2,000 rounds, had made Japan's home islands defenseless in daylight. The Ki-84 Hate, though impressive on paper and flown by brave men, never had the numbers, reliability, or skilled pilots to fight back effectively. It was never a fair fight. It was a foregone conclusion, decided as much by factories in Detroit and oil wells in Texas as by the dogfights over Tokyo. American industrial power, embodied in the P-51 Mustang, accomplished what naval blockades and island hopping could not: the total destruction of Japan's ability to defend its skies. When the B-29s dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they flew without fighter escort, not because there were no Mustangs available, but because none were needed. The Japanese fighter force had been completely wiped from the skies, crushed by America's unmatched technology, training, and production power. Out of the 3,514 Ki-84s ever built, only one still exists today, displayed in the Chiran Peace Museum in Kagoshima, Japan. It stands alone, a quiet symbol of Japan's desperate struggle to compete with America's overwhelming technological edge. In contrast, hundreds of P-51 Mustangs still exist around the world, many beautifully restored, still flying in air shows, their Merlin engines roaring the song of American industrial triumph, even 7 decades later. This massive difference in how many survive tells its own story. American aircraft were built to last, maintained with precision, and preserved as history. Japanese planes were built for short-term survival, designed to fight and be destroyed, seen as expendable tools of war. For Japanese pilots, seeing P-51 Mustangs over Tokyo was more than just a tactical shock. It was a crushing revelation. They realized that American technology and industry had made the impossible seem routine. Single-engine fighters flying 1,500-mile missions, fighting for 2 hours and returning safely. Such feats were beyond Japan's reach. The image of a P-51D Mustang soaring over Mount Fuji became more than a sight of war. It was a symbol of American industrial power, technological brilliance, and the mathematical certainty of total war. The message was clear and harsh. In modern industrial warfare, superior technology multiplied by massive production equals victory. The P-51D Mustang stood as the ultimate expression of America's industrial and military peak, with over 15,000 aircraft produced to secure that victory. Each P-51D Mustang came off the production line with consistent quality, flown by highly trained pilots, backed by unlimited supplies, and used with strategic precision. Against this kind of power, Japan's Ki-84 Hate, no matter how brave its pilots or how clever its tactics, never stood a real chance. The sight of American fighters over Tokyo wasn't just a military shock. It was the cold truth of mathematics. A truth that ended with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, carried out by B-29s that didn't even need escort anymore because Japan's Air Force had ceased to exist. The Mustangs had done their job with ruthless efficiency. They proved that distance offered no safety, that industrial power defeated warrior spirit, and that technology, when used with skill, was unbeatable. For the Japanese pilots who faced them in those final months, the lesson was devastating. Courage alone could not fight against the numbers, the math of mass production, advanced machines, and endless resources. The P-51D Mustang over Tokyo marked the end of an era. The age of the samurai gave way to the age of the factory, the supercharger, and the very long-range fighter. The legendary divine wind had been conquered by science, the warrior's spirit crushed by industrial strength, and the empire of the rising sun was overshadowed by wings of aluminum and engines of steel.